All right. So I have a slide that has the goals and objectives. Let me share my screen so that you all can see it. Okay. Okay, so I love when that's right in the way. So what I did was take some of the feedback from our previous conversation around our goals and objectives, and I've done three main things. One is to add this notion of health into our first goal. I think that was an important piece of learning from our conversation with Taylor, right? Is that one of the ways that we could put some bounds around what we're doing is to focus our assessment on health. Certainly, I mean, we can argue, especially as public health folks, that almost anything that we ask can be tied to health, right? But it felt like maybe including health here will allow us to center that as our focal point for when we're deciding which questions to ask, which data to include. So that was one piece that I did. The second piece was to create the second goal, and that was based on our conversation as well around what wasn't captured in this first one was this notion of actually presenting the information that we learned and also providing the recommendations. So that's what I sort of tried to capture in the second goal. And then the last thing I did was to highlight which objectives fall under this second goal. So those are the changes that I've made so far. What else do you want to talk about, edit, change before we sort of move forward? And again, we can continue to revisit this. If today we can get it to a point where we feel like it's a workable set of goals and objectives. Yeah, Rachel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Rachel's comment was about this other piece of the process where we've talked about a more informal opportunity to gather some feedback. And when we left after Thursday's conversation, that was the piece that I thought we never really got and so maybe I'll just reach back out to Taylor individually to ask. I got a little bit of a sense of maybe that felt a little bit overwhelming to think of to commit to an additional piece. So maybe does that sound good for you all, that I'll send her an email and kind of ask, you know, we still have an interest in doing this other piece. Does it feel like you have capacity for this? And if so, what would that look like? And anybody who's online also please feel free to chime in. Okay, what else?
Hey, Chrissy.
Yeah.
There was basically they have Homeward Alliance is going to be doing a vaccine clinic as part of like a statewide health equity initiative. So they're like waiting to get approved. But Taylor had invited the students involved in the vaccine campaign to like come on 2 days where they're going to table and try to just like encourage people to sign up and could come to the vaccine clinic. And so she did say that was an opportunity for students to get involved. And so maybe, because I'm not sure a lot of people from that group can make the tabling events, but maybe if we can like ask if this group might be able to go, because she said new faces are actually really helpful because it encourages people to like come and talk because they want to know like who you are or what is going on. So I just wanted to like throw that out there. I don't know, maybe people are like, yeah, that's too soon because it's like April 8th and 12th that the tabling events are going to be, but
okay.
Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I need to figure out how to share the audio. Anybody know how to do that? I thought with HDMI that audio just is part of it. Okay, there's a separate audio. Yeah. We were just talking about whether and how I might be able to share the audio. That's okay, I can summarize. Oh yeah, do you have an idea? I'm sure it probably is. Any of you on sound settings? Input. No, not input. Or is it input? Advanced sound settings. Oh, thank you. I don't think it's speakers though, right? Because it's the HDMI. Can one of you who's on the computer say something?
Testing.
Well, you're louder, but still not, you're still going through my computer. Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't know. I'll see if I can look. I assume that's what I'm on. Yeah, I'll see if I can look this up before the next time, but I'll keep sharing out. So one of the things that Hannah was just mentioning was those of you who are working on the campaigns, in the campaigns class, that there's the vaccine clinics that Taylor had mentioned perhaps you could attend. Is this sounding familiar to anybody who's in that? Yeah, the tabling. Hannah was mentioning that could be a possibility, Taylor said, of collecting some of the more informal information. It sounds like those dates are April 8th and 12th. So we certainly, I think we could have something together by then. And it probably would be, and so we could talk about, you know, what that would look like, but maybe it's a short survey or something where when folks come to get their vaccine, you could ask if they're willing to share their thoughts on, you know, a couple of questions, or, you know, we talked about the mapping kind of thing. So I think that could definitely work if we wanted to try and move that forward and sort of prioritize that over this next week or so. That is on your spring break. When I need to, oh yeah, I need a calendar. So we would also just have to figure out if people are available on those days. What days of the week are those? Is that a Monday?
The 8th is a Thursday. No, the
Thursday.
12th is a Monday, I think.
Do you know what time those were going to be?
9 to noon, weather permitting.
9 a.m. to noon. Are they outdoor? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I certainly think if Taylor felt like that was a good way to collect that information, we could, if we had the schedule, we could also, if Taylor would find that helpful, ask if folks are interested in participating in a more formal interview, right? And it could also potentially be used as a recruiting opportunity for the key informant interviews. Okay, that's a great idea. So if we were to do that, we still have some time. We could try to make sure that next week we get that ironed out and figured out so that we could collect some of that information. And then we would need to figure out who is comfortable and interested in being there during that time. I'm also thinking, MJ mentioned, now I can't remember, I assume this was the same event that they were needing or student help at it might have been the vaccine clinic, and that there's a possibility that you could get your vaccine if you were able to volunteer and interested in volunteering. So I will follow up with them on that also. Okay. Okay, so if we circle back to the goals and objectives, anything else missing or that we want to reframe? Those of you online probably can't hear, but nobody in class is saying anything yet, in case you had something that you wanted to chime in with. Okay. We feel like we're at an okay place for now. We'll sort of leave it here. We'll figure out this other piece that we're talking about and then kind of go from there. So then the next piece that I wanted to, talk about, thanks Hannah for putting some of those details in the chat. The next thing I wanted to talk about then is this sort of check-in number 2. And the way, and I put this in the notes for today, right? But the way that I'm sort of thinking about this next check-in is 3 groups. One would focus on designing, administering, and coding the interviews with community organizations. One would focus on those same tasks with guests or people experiencing homelessness or those who are recently housed. And then the other group would work on taking the framework document that was done in step 1 and starting to fill out some of those relevant parts and pieces, right? You might take the existing written background and justification section and kind of start plugging it in. You might look at other statistics or things you want to put in there. Maybe we think about some of the methods, right? Methods are always a helpful place to start because we will know our methods long before we know our results, right? And so you could draft out some of the methods sections. You could think about how it's starting to look and work on the visual aspects of it and how visually appealing it is. And so that's the other group that I'm kind of thinking about. I am super happy to rethink how I've thought about these if you have other ideas. So I'll first pause and just see, one, if there's something you feel like is missing that we need to be prioritizing right now. The other piece of this is the quantitative data piece I've sort of included here for now. If this quantitative data piece ends up being, yes, we have access to all the data and there's a lot that we can do within that, then we can kind of, we can either deprioritize filling out the framework and work on data, right? There's some ways to be flexible within that. But is there anything that you're thinking about that's missing from here that you think we need to be prioritizing right now? Yeah, Rachel. Yeah, so Rachel's comment about within the 2 groups of guests and community orgs, that there may be different roles within there in terms of who's designing, who's administering it, who's coding it, or the interviews. My thought is likely, or this was my initial intention, but you all tell me if you want to think differently about it, was if you're part of that group, let's say we're talking about community organizations, then you're working together as a group to finalize the script. You're going to sort of divide up the opportunities and you will all have a chance to conduct 2 or 3 of the actual interviews. And then you also would all be coding. So that's how I had thought about it, but certainly I'm open to kind of talking through if there's a better way. Maybe there's like a lead person, right? So maybe within the community orgs group, maybe there's a lead person who's really finalizing the script, right? You're working all together on coming up with the questions and whatnot, but one person is structuring it, making sure, you know, just kind of leading that part of it. Maybe one person is leading the logistics of scheduling, right? Maybe, so you can kind of think of some lead roles within that. That might be a helpful way, just to make sure that nothing, you know, sort of falls by the wayside a little bit. What do you think? Yeah, so once these groups are formed, starting in with then some lead roles and timelines. Okay. I'm hopeful that there are enough of you who are open to different groups that there will be enough flexibility that everyone will sign up for something that you're even somewhat interested in. But so I'm not totally sure the best way to do this. We can do it similar to kind of how we did it the first time around. And maybe if you spoke up early the first time around, or if you don't have a strong choice the second time around, maybe you sort of hold back. And those of you who this time feel like you have a strong interest in one group or another, and let's just try it and sort of see how that goes. Does that feel okay? Okay. So who so far, I see some of you are, this is probably those of you who are online, because the rest of you probably don't have the spreadsheet. Anybody have sort of a strong, like, gosh, I'd really love to be part of this group? Yeah. Okay. That may work better for your schedule anyways. Yeah, Ashley. Okay. Lisa, same. Okay. Yeah, Hannah, I see you have your hand up.
Oh, I was saying
Hannah,
I'm interested in that group.
Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Is there anybody who was wishing you could do that group that isn't in that group currently? Okay. So then anybody have a strong preference between guests and community orgs? Okay. Yeah, how many? Okay. 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 Well, anybody online have a strong, Morgan or Juliana, do you have a strong preference yet?
I don't have a strong preference, so feel free to put me in either. I just want to preface that my schedule is just a little wonky, so I just don't know how available I'll be to like if there were like blocks of time, you know, like I don't know. I mean, I could rework stuff, but just want to put that out there as well. So happy to do a lot of stuff on the back end of like organizing, reaching out, coding. I just don't know how available I'll be to like actually go and like conduct interviews.
Okay, that's really helpful, Morgan. Okay, and yeah, Rachel. Okay. Okay. So maybe what we should do is, it feels like slightly more schedule flexibility might make sense for guests. It's just an initial thought. How about those of you who haven't said yet? Kat, what do you think? What are your thoughts so far? Okay. So, yeah, so my first thought then, if you don't have a super strong preference, if you do have a couple days that are slightly more flexible, maybe I'll put you there for now, if that's okay. Okay, let's see. Who else hasn't? Okay, so then maybe we, maybe I'll divide Morgan and Rachel, since you're both more of a back, may be able to take on a little bit more back end. Do either of you have a preference with that in mind, knowing that you might, I mean, I think it'd be great if you had the chance to do one or two of the interviews, but do either of you have a preference?
Has Rachel said anything?
I can see.
Well, maybe could they be?
I see that it might be my.
Could they be like the coders for both groups, and like they're in charge of coding, and then the other two groups just design and administer? Does that make sense? Or is that a lot of work for two people?
I think it's not only a lot of work, but also I'd like to give more of you a chance to do the coding. And I think having a slightly larger group of coders, that sort of, what is the word? Validity, right? Like just having more people looking at the data can make it a little bit more valid. So that's my thought there. Juliana, I saw you're in the chat either way. In my mind, I think we should probably have a larger group with guests, knowing that if it is more chunks of time, right, it seems like that might make sense. So then Morgan and Rachel, I'll just put each of you, but yeah, do either of you have a, Morgan, did you come up with new?
I just asked, I didn't know if Rachel had said anything. Or if she has a
She has
preference.
not yet said.
Okay.
Not really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy just to, since what you were saying about flexibility, I guess I'm happy to go with guests just in case there is like a needed gap, but like I am available to go and do that. I'm fine to do that.
Does that feel okay? Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, so then, if we were thinking about community orgs, if let's say we have 12 people we're interested in reaching out to, I'm not sure that we would get all 12 being interested, but even if we did, then each of you would likely be doing about 4. My guess is you'll probably do about 3 of them. That's my hope, at least, that we can get enough that, that you can each conduct a few of the interviews. So the next piece of this I'm thinking is actually going ahead and meeting in your small groups to kind of talk through some of this. But what I'd like to maybe do first is maybe we can spend a few minutes on the focus group, or excuse me, the interview questions, so that we can get to a reasonably good point with those. And then you can kind of meet in your groups and think through some next steps, some timelines, who wants to take a little bit more of a lead role on which part. Does that feel like it will work for some of our time today? Okay. And then Morgan and Juliana, since you're both in the same group, I can just move my computer over there. Hannah, maybe we can call you when we break out into our small groups, and you can kind of be with that group. Are we allowed to move around in the classroom? You know how I have to fill out those seating charts? I don't know the answer to that. Okay. Okay. The response was they do it in the other class. So, okay. So let's talk then, I have that pulled up also, about some of the key informant interview questions. And a couple of things that I'm thinking about, sort of the length of the interview. Something that I think can work well is once we have our list of questions, we will prioritize them. We'll always start with some sort of introduction, getting to know you a little bit at the beginning, some really sort of easy questions that allow you to sort of build some rapport at the beginning. Then we'll jump into the questions that feel most important. And then you can always have a couple additional questions that it's great if you get to them. If you don't, that's okay too, right? Ultimately, we definitely want to honor and respect people's time. So that's just kind of how I think about the format. So let's start with the questions, and then we can also develop, because this will, I think this will be something you can do in your small groups, is that initial stuff of like talking a little bit about the project, what you're interested in, some of that initial stuff. So let's focus on questions right now and see kind of how far we get. So I have the really nice draft that the group created as part of the first check-in. So let's kind of talk through one note that when I talked to, I can't remember if this was a conversation when Taylor was with us in class or that I had separate with Taylor, but this notion of identities that may or may not land asked as it is. So some of these questions we can just kind of make a note and ask Taylor if there's a way to reword it, or if there's a way again to get at the information that we're trying to get at. So maybe we start by sort of just reviewing the questions, and then we can talk through how we want to prioritize, what else we want to ask about. Maybe there's a way that we highlight the ones that are related specifically to health, because again, those probably will be the ones that we want to prioritize. Let me put the link in the chat in case those of you who are remote want to access it. Yes, absolutely. That worked. But I can do a little more if you need. Is that okay? Okay, so we can start with client or guest questions. Please feel free, if you're on here and you want to make an edit as we're talking, feel free to do that. Okay, so how did you learn about health and other resources and where to go for them? So one thought that I have is one of the initial questions that might be interesting would be, maybe it's not an initial question, but a question around how some sort of self-reported measure of health, right? So how do you would you describe your health, or something like that, so that people can describe for themselves how they view their own health status. So I don't know exactly how we would state that, but how would you describe? Let's just read through them first, maybe. How do you get around? Yeah, that was my other thing, you know, I know we've talked a lot about this, right? But how are we making this a balanced assessment so that we're learning about the strengths that currently exist, as well as opportunities and gaps and whatnot. Sorry, I'm gonna go back to the top for a second. So some of these I think might be helpful. How long have you been in the area? What does a typical day look like for you? I think some of those are nice intro questions. Bless you. I think it can be helpful to start after you've given an overview, and again, we won't work on that piece, but maybe an initial question is, what questions do you have for me, right? Is there any, right? So that if they have questions about you, for you, they want to know about the project more, right? That you start with a question about what questions do you have for me before we get started. now I'm- Okay. So then if it were me, the next thing I would ask about are, what are some of the health services that you access regularly, right? I think sometimes it can be helpful to ask people, similar to what does a typical day look like for you, is can you tell me a story of, right, a time when you accessed healthcare, or, right? So I think this idea of storytelling can be helpful. And so, yeah, I would probably start with what are some of the what are some of the ways that you access healthcare? And then we can get into like what would make you, so this one, I think before we ask what would make you feel more respected, we're making an assumption by asking that question that they aren't feeling respected. And while data certainly shows that that's the case, that may not be the lived experience for everyone that we speak to. So you may start by asking, how respected do you feel in healthcare settings? And then, and potentially following that up with, what does it look like to feel respected in a healthcare setting, right? Before, again, we sort of put our lens to say, we're assuming you're not feeling respected, and we're assuming you'd like to feel more respected without knowing for sure. I like this sort of, who's been your favorite healthcare provider, or your best experiences with the healthcare system, why, or what made them your favorite. Again, is sort of delving into, right, our goal here is to learn about the why behind things, right? What is it about that setting that makes it a really positive experience for you? And maybe what we'll do is we'll keep going through kind of like this without formally doing them all. Then when you're in your groups, take some of the conversation that we've had and try to sort of work through some of the questions a little bit more. This one might be one of those questions that isn't highest priority, but that I think it would be great to ask. And if we have a bunch of health specific questions, or maybe we shift this to say, how do you get around to healthcare appointments, or however we want to ask that. And then we can also have a more general question about transportation, that sort of second. I think this is a nice question. Do you use, and then sort of fill in the blank, right? We can identify some of the resources that we're most interested in. Some we can make an assumption, right? If the interview is at the Murphy Center, although we may recruit from somewhere else and they may come to the Murphy Center just for the interview. So I suppose we may not be able to make that assumption. Yeah. How often was Kat's comment? And you can, again, we can rework these, but we're just kind of taking some notes so far. Oh, I see. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Javier's question around how do we use these things that come after the initial question? So it can be a couple different ways. One can be, so they're all sort of meant to be probes, right? So how do you get around Fort Collins? And they may start by saying, you know, I primarily use the bus. And so if you wanted to know, then you could ask, how often do you walk to get places? Are there other forms of transportation that you use? Some of them are more about, like some of these are really separate questions. That's not a great example. Like these two are really separate questions, right? But in the script, this is a nice example where in the script, you might have a statement that says, now we're going to talk about some of your good and bad experiences with accessing health. So it's sort of that transition. And you say, my first question is if you tell me about some of your really positive experiences with healthcare, right? But sometimes these subsequent questions will be probes. Most of the time though, probing is just like trying to get a little bit more information. So again, the most common probe would be, could you tell me a little bit more about that? This one, you know, what made them your favorite, right? Those kinds of things. So when we get to a more final version of the script, I think it will be clear, and that'll be part of your developing of the script and the list of questions is maybe underneath you have, these are the probes. So as we go along, I think that will become a little more clear. Anything else you're thinking about for this question? So my suggestion for next steps would be to number the questions, reorder them, think through what are our initial getting to know you questions, what are our high priority next 5 or 6, and what are some of the sort of lower priority next one. Okay. These are probably some that might be lower priority only because unless we sort of reframe them to talk specifically about health and health related resources. You know, I think you can even ask a broad question to say, what comes to mind for you when we talk about health resources, right? Because if you keep saying in your questions, what health resources do you use or what healthcare resources, right? Having an understanding of what are they perceiving when you say that is really important to inform their responses to the question. So anytime you use terminology that could have different interpretations, asking how they perceive something or how they would define something is a really important starting point. Okay.
Dr. Chard.
All right, so then some of the questions for, yeah.
Well,
Go ahead,
I was
Hannah.
wondering if there's like a number of questions these groups should use as like a cap. Like, I guess I'm thinking of like an hour-long conversation. It seems like any more than like 8 to 10 to 12 questions is gonna, you know, that might help narrow it down if there's like a number.
Yep. So yeah, I think, you know, a few of those entry questions, 6 or 8 that are meant to be the bulk of the conversation, and then these additional 4-ish that if we get to it, great. I think that's probably a reasonable approach. We can always, I think, have, you know, there's always opportunities to say, if you're feeling like you're just blowing through these questions, to say, could you elaborate more on and give a specific, right, example or experience that you'd like them to elaborate a little bit more on? So yeah, is that helpful in just sort of thinking about a couple entry, 6 or 8 that are the focus, and then an additional small handful if you get to them? Okay, so then if we're looking at the provider questions, I think similarly, we'll do a little bit of an intro of this is who we are, this is what we're doing, right? This is the purpose of what we're doing. And then we have those sort of same questions, always starting with what questions do you have for me before we get started? And then delving into the actual questions that we have. Okay, so I think I think, again, you can sort of ask is, what are your experiences working with people experiencing homelessness? And again, start really broad and see what comes out for people. What are their perceptions of their experience working with people experiencing homelessness? So starting kind of broad that way. I think you can ask, what services do you provide, right? And again, they may say something on their website, and when you ask, they may say something different, right? Or you could ask, what do you view as the most important services you provide? Or what do you view as the services that are most accessed, right? So getting their perception of what services are most important. That will be interesting to line up with perceptions by folks who are currently experiencing homelessness and currently accessing those services. Is anybody taking notes, or you just have this in your head? Okay. This question I think is interesting. And it might be, I think maybe wanting to know, what is the goal? What are we trying to understand better by asking this question? Maybe reframing it so that it gets at what exactly we want to know. I also think you could ask, a way to ask questions always is like supports and barriers, or facilitators and barriers, right? What are some of the facilitators and barriers to people accessing your services? I think could be a helpful question here. The other thing I'm thinking about is, it's quite possible that the provider interviews might be able to be half an hour. So that certainly is, it might make it easier for people to agree to if they're half an hour. So let's just kind of, those of you who are working on that group, as you're kind of drafting your questions and whatnot, know that it doesn't, you don't have to try to ask a bunch of things to make sure that it's going to take an hour. If this is a half an hour interview, then it's a half an hour interview. All right, so let's pause here and let's get into our groups and see if we can work on some initial, like I said, I think ideally having the draft list of questions, I'll review it, I can send it to Taylor. That's probably our highest priority, at least for the two groups who are working on that. The group that's working on the framework, you all, I think, you'll probably want to open that framework back up and revisit what sections are in there, what sections can we go ahead and get working on, who wants to take a lead on which part of it, who wants to be the person that's looking sort of how visually appealing it is, right? So kind of talking through some of those pieces. The other thing that will be helpful from that group is for you to let us know what's still missing, right? What haven't we thought of yet? Is there something that we're proposing to do in this framework that isn't on our radar yet? So that will be a helpful perspective from that group. Okay. What questions do you have before we get into some groups for this last 15 or 20 minutes? Yeah, Rachel. Yeah, so Rachel's question was around whether we want the client interviews to inform the provider interviews. I think that in an ideal situation, I think that would be great. I'm not sure if we take our calendar and backtrack, because in reality, we probably need to have the client interviews coded before we would know really what themes we want to add in. So I think I'm not sure it's realistic. That said, I definitely think we could still have these questions. I envision this being something that we can build on, right? So part of what that framework, I think, includes, and if not, somebody take this note, is like next steps, right? And so in that framework, in that next step section can be, here are the questions that people experiencing homelessness want to know from providers, right? And then again, it gives some really clear guidance as to what comes next. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about that, given the sort of time-bound nature of what we're trying to do. I feel like, so the question being whether we still want to even ask those questions. My thought right now in this moment is yes, but maybe we revisit that. I'll think a little bit more about it. You know, I have mentioned a couple times that if there are students in here who are interested in a practicum, you know, if you're looking for summer practicum and you had an interest in taking this work and seeing it further, right, that I think that's an opportunity. Either way, I'll be working on it with Taylor and MJ. So I think that there will be at least a bit of an ongoing nature to it. So that's my initial answer, Rachel, but let's revisit that. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna, let's see if we can go ahead and get into our, well, that's not what I wanted, into our group. All right, so Javier, Rachel, so Shannon, maybe you can pop over by the two of them. Let's see, Juliana and Morgan, I'll move you, Jake, and Kat. So Kat, maybe you can come up this way. If you could probably bring this chair to the other side of the table. I'm gonna do my best to connect Morgan and Juliana to this group. Hannah, do you want me to call you?
I'm gonna FaceTime Callie.
Oh, perfect. Look at you all just getting this figured out without me. Okay. And then Morgan and Juliana, if it's not working for you to hear, I can also just call you both and we can put you on a three-way call and put my phone in the middle. That might end up being easier. I actually think that might definitely be easier now that I'm thinking about it. Is that okay?